Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Pam Reads. Today we are continuing in our story, Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella. This is, and I looked this time, this is part 4, section 5. And in our last video, Ray and Jerry and Archie and Eddie Skizzens, who they picked up in town, all arrived at the farm, and they discovered that Ray has an identical twin brother who he's kind of estranged from. And then they went to examine the field, and the visitors were not particularly impressed. And so they started working on getting it back in shape because Ray's been gone for a little while. It's kind of overgrown. So that's where we'll start today. Out in the night, the metal cattle guard twangs as a cat crosses it. A taxi pulls into the yard, its roof light glowing green as an electric line. Then Richard, Ray's brother, stands dark in the kitchen doorway. I look up from the table. It is as if I am staring into a full-length mirror. We don't leap into each other's arms, backslapping and recalling old joys. We shake hands cautiously, as if there is a referee holding his hand out like a knife between us. We loved each other as brothers should, no more, no less. I said to Annie once, and she looked at me uncomprehendingly. Except for an occasional burst of camaraderie, which came like thunderstorms, we were never close. Mother didn't dress us alike or try to enhance what nature had already done. Twins can never escape from each other, I read in a book once. We are like the Gemini astrology sign. I make coffee, and we sit across the table from each other, staring. How do we know? How do we know which of us is which? What if it was I who punched the fist through the wall in our farmhouse near Deer Lodge, Montana? What if it has been me who has swished like a tumbleweed across the face of America for 20 years, traveling like a long-distance mover with no home base? Going from New Orleans to Amarillo, Kansas City to Chicago, Cleveland to Baltimore, and back again, over and over. What if Annie and Karen are his family, and I am rootless as a pulled weed? So tell me, where have you been? What have you done? Have you got a year? Says Richard and laughs, my laugh. Where did you go when you left? When did you find out that Dad was dead? Why didn't you at least write to Mother? Questions pour out of me. I try not to make them sound incriminating, but fail. I knew what was going to happen before I ever picked the fight with Dad. Hell, I've got feathers in my shoes. You were weighed down with lead, just like them. I've always thought of myself as kind of a bird, flying from one thing to another. Birds never go back to the nest once they've flown away. You didn't answer any of my questions. I've been with the carnival for 10 years now. You learn how not to answer questions. Why did you come back now? There's a little homing device in all of us. I admit, I've been pulled a few times. A year or so ago, I started looking for Kinsellas in every phone book in every town we passed through. I found a Raymond down in McLean, Texas, and I phoned him. He didn't know where he got his name. Then, a week ago, I came to Iowa City. They changed the schedule. We don't usually stop here. Have too much equipment for a single block they'd give us to set up. I've always gone straight on to Cedar Rapids. I looked in the Iowa City phone book and there you were. I phoned and asked the lady who answered if you ever came from Deer Lodge, Montana, and she didn't have to answer. I could tell by the long pause that you did, and that she thought she was talking to you, and that you were playing some kind of a game with her. He stops and smiles. That lady, of course, is yours, and she is something else. And Karen, I'd chop off an arm bit by bit for a child like Karen. He smiles again. I looked around here and I see that it's not so bad to be lead-footed. I've always thought it would be like having one foot nailed to the earth and turning in tight circles ever after. But now I'm not so sure. You must be happy with a wife and child like that. You must be happy. I am. But you haven't seen anything. You haven't met the others. You haven't seen the field. What's going on here anyway? Annie just says something about you building a baseball diamond, but Karen says there are games on it. I walked around it one night and it was eerie, like I could hear leaves rustling where there weren't any trees. We're cleaning it up, I say. You can help after breakfast if you want to. Richard isn't the only one who can avoid answering questions. Have you ever been married? I asked, but the question is heavy as a paperweight, and the silence that follows is awkward. I have moved in too close, too fast. I have a lady, Richard finally says. She works in the change booth at the carnival. She's called Gypsy, and only the head office in Florida knows her whole name. She ran away from somewhere when she was 13, says she's a gypsy. Been telling it to people for so long, she believes it herself. She's like me, got feathers for feet. We're convenient for each other, but we can either of us fly away whenever we want. He pauses. Some guy told me once that her family owns a motel in Kellogg, Idaho, and that they've offered a $10,000 reward for information about her. Says the reward's been unclaimed for over 10 years. I think about it whenever I'm broke. At breakfast, Salinger fries the bacon. Eddie tends the coffee. Have you got any eggshells? Eddie wants to know. Real coffee has eggshells in it. That was the way Ellen did it. Every morning of our married life, she brewed up a pot of coffee, one of them gray enamel jobs. The pot was not like this thing. He nods contemptuously at the glass and plastic wonder that pre-measures water and coffee and even makes the brew strong or weak according to the push of a button. I am cooking the eggs, grease spitting onto the backs of my hands, for I have the burner turned too high. All I've got are these, I say, pointing to the glistening white shells I've split open on the edge of the pan. Have to be dry, says Eddie derisively. You save them, let them dry in the warming oven. And they have to be brown. Only eggs from brown hens are any good in coffee. You dry them and crumble them and toss a handful in with the grounds, and you watch them boil and roll around in the pot. Joe DiMaggio sold this coffee maker on television, I say, as if trying to give it some legitimacy. Moonlight Graham is tending the toaster, while Karen, in a cardinal-colored dressing gown, stands on a chair, butters the toast, and stacks it on the plates. Someone speaks to me, but I barely hear, for I am thinking of the story of Marilyn Monroe returning from a trip to entertain the troops in Korea, returning to an unhappy Joe DiMaggio who had not wanted her to go. There were thousands and thousands of soldiers everywhere I went, Marilyn said. You never heard such cheering. Yes, I have, replied the Yankee clipper sadly. The phone rings. Annie answers it on the upstairs extension and yells down that it is for me. Take over the eggs, I say to Richard, who has been drawn downstairs by the bacon and coffee smells. Ray, Mark says in his professional voice, it's good to have you back. We have some business to discuss. Have you thought any more about our last offer? I told you what you could do with it before I left. Why should I change my mind? Oh, no reason, says Mark, as if he knows something I don't know. The place is not for sale. We'll up the ante $25,000, says Mark. No. I'm afraid you're going to have to come up with some cash rather quickly then. I feel as if I've reached for my wallet and found the pocket empty. How so? I guess you haven't seen Mr. Schism since you got back. I have. He's right here, sitting at my table. Oh, really? Says Mark. I look sharply at Eddie. He becomes intent on watching the coffee dribble into the squat receptacle beneath the machine. I guess he doesn't have the nerve to tell you, Mark goes on. We've optioned your mortgage. At the end of 60 days, we own it. So unless you bring it up to date and keep it up to date, we have the legal right to foreclose. If you read your contract, you'll find that the full amount of the mortgage becomes due if you fall even 1 day behind in your payments. We wouldn't foreclose, of course, unless you left us with no choice. So, I suggest you think hard about the offer we've made you. I can see Mark twirling his mustache as he says this, with Bluestein in the background, rubbing his hands together and cackling. I proceed to tell Mark, spitting the profanities out like bullets, that I am uninterested in his offer now or ever. As I hang up the phone, I turn to Eddie Schisms. Why? I bellow. They made me, whispers Eddie, sitting down on one of the maple chairs that surround the oval table. How could they make you? You don't need the money. They know things, Eddie says helplessly. His hand shakes violently as he tries to raise his coffee cup to his lips. I have about as much chance of cracking the New York Yankee starting lineup as I have of bringing the mortgage payments up to date. My impulse is to march Eddie to the car, drive him back to his apartment, or to the Friendship Center and never see him again. But I know that for some reason I need him here, that he is part of the cosmic jigsaw puzzle that has so altered my life. Phew, says Annie, bounding down the stairs, making motions of knocking water out of her ears. You haven't cussed like that since you stuck your tongue on the wire fence 2 winters ago. I grab a slice of toast and a handful of bacon strips as I head for the door. I thought you knew what I'd done, says Eddie in a voice that, for the first time, sounds his age, and that you brought me out here to hurt me. He looks beaten. What can Mark and Bluestein have used to blackmail him? It can only be something I already know. Or is there more to Eddie Schism's past than even I have guessed? I'll be working on the field, I say. Anyone who wants to can help, but they're finished when they're finished with breakfast. That afternoon, while the others are working on the field with varying degrees of enthusiasm, Annie and I drive to Iowa City. A check of Johnson County land title records show why my brother-in-law is so anxious to acquire my land. A perusal of county maps shows why my little farm is so important. On the county map, the land is divided up neatly as a checkerboard. And when I take one of Karen's yellow crayons and color in the quarter sections owned by Blue Mark Properties, Inc., it looks like a giant crossword puzzle with only a few black squares. My farm is one of the black squares. I note the names of the owners of the other privately owned land and phone them. Yes, the farm's been sold recently, they all tell me. What Blue Mark Properties, Inc. has acquired is 64 quarter sections, or 16 sections, or 10,240 acres of prime corn growing land. That is, they have all but one portion, my farm, which sits on the little map like a black plum in a field of golden peaches. For the last couple of years, Mark has been extolling the virtues of what he calls computer farming. And I can imagine what he said as he and Bluestein started buying up the farms. I can tell you for a fact, we won't have any trouble with this one, he would have said to the boardroom full of shadowy men in three-piece suits. This one is owned by my sister and brother-in-law. He's a little weird, so deep in debt, he'll be happy to sell. I can visualize what they want to do. You don't need fences and corn. Farmhands will roll the barbed wire fence up a giant wooden spools and staples crying like shot animals as they are wrenched from the wood. Then the posts will be pulled and stacked to be sold in areas where farming is less sophisticated. The houses and outbuildings will all be torn down, bulldozed and hauled away, making the plains as flat and silent and lifeless as they were 150 years ago. The farm will be run from one concrete bunker, the size of an electrical transformer station. One man will sit in a bluish light in front of a television screen that every 15 minutes provides updated information about market prices, weather forecasts, legislative happenings, plantings, spray and harvest advisories, USDA news, and dozens of other topics, data fed into the computer on a continuing basis. When he wants information, the computer farmer simply dials a special phone number and punches the proper code on what is called a green thumb box. Mark has told me about it again and again. His beady eyes blazing like those of a zealous evangelist. And at command from a single pale figure posed vulture-like over the computer screen, battalions of combines can be unleashed to gobble up the crops and spew them into trucks to be wheeled to market, all neat and clean and sterile and heartless. But you owe the land something, I complained weakly to Mark. It's not just a product, not plastic and foam and paint imported from Taiwan or Korea, meant to be used once and discarded. But my words went unheeded, and I can see the ghostly accountants, technicians, and bankers lurking behind Mark, counting money and reinvesting profits. You have been touched by the land, I cried. Once you've been touched by the land, the wind never blows so cold again, because your love files the edges off it. And when the land suffers from flood or drought or endless winter, you feel for it more than for yourself, and you do what you can to ease its pain. Mark stared at me, uncomprehending, seeing only the money breeding, incestuously diversifying, multiplying. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Whereas I saw the silent tides of corn, lonely and alien in their own vast land. But this morning on the phone, Mark's voice had risen in an anxious whine, and there was controlled desperation in his sales pitch. The same desperation I sometimes felt when I had failed to sell a life insurance policy for over a month and could picture creditors marching in front of my apartment carrying picket signs, chanting. As I checked the maps again, I realized that I have been backed into a position of power, like a weak team aided by a spate of errors made by the champions. Syndicates like all business transactions to go smoothly. A project is either complete or it is not. They will be irate, hopefully even vengeful or violent, if Mark and Bluestein cannot deliver on their promises. If I can hold my land, remain free, it could begin a chain reaction that, like opening a row of cages in a zoo, would free half of Johnson County, Iowa, from this computer farming syndicate. Mark, Bluestein, and their associates have a sinister master plan for the whole area, and our little quarter section is like a fly backstroking in their crab bisque. And we'll stop there. That was quite a vivid description. All right, you guys. Oh, get unfolded here. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you hopefully when this story picks up a little bit. That was kind of just a descriptive section, but we know there's some good action coming. So hang with me, and I will see you next time.